He thought I'd just roll over and let him take everything I'd built. He thought my love for him, or what I remembered of it, would make me weak. He thought that after 4 years of marriage, I just wouldn't have the stomach for a fight. He was wrong. The man I loved was a ghost, a carefully constructed illusion. But the man I was fighting in court? He was very, very real. And he was trying to ruin me. He had completely underestimated me, mistaking my kindness for weakness and my trust for naivety. He was about to learn that the same fire I used to build a $1 million company from scratch was the same fire I'd used to burn his deception to the ground. To understand how I ended up in a sterile lawyer's office, getting ready for an all-out war for my own company, we have to go back. Not just 4 years, but even further. We have to go back to a time when my life was just mine. Before him. Back to when I met the man I thought was the love of my life. My life, before Jake, was a whirlwind of my own making. I was 30 years old, living in Los Angeles, and pouring my soul into a dream that had taken over my late 20s, my own boutique digital marketing firm. It wasn't just a job, it was my entire identity. It was born from late nights swimming in cheap coffee, early mornings spent perfecting pitches in my tiny apartment, and that terrifying, thrilling feeling of leaving a stable job to bet on myself. I still remember the day I landed my first major client. I walked out of their high-rise office into the blinding LA sun and felt like I could actually levitate. I hadn't just sold them a marketing strategy, I'd sold them on me. On my vision, my passion, and my relentless belief that I could build something real. That company was my baby. I obsessed over it, nurtured it, and watched it grow from a tiny idea into a thriving business that was finally getting noticed. My friends joked that I was married to my work, and honestly, they were right. I was fiercely protective of it because I knew exactly what it cost me to build. It was forged in sacrifice, in missed parties, forgotten hobbies, and moments of doubt so deep they nearly broke me. But it was mine. Every single win, every failure, every dollar it earned, was a testament to my own grit. I was fulfilled. I was busy. I was happy. Love felt like a concept for other people, people who had more time and less on the line. And then, I met Jake. It wasn't a movie scene. It was a loud, crowded birthday party for a friend at a bar downtown. I was only there out of obligation, planning to stay for an hour, nurse one drink, and then sneak back to my laptop to finish a proposal. He was in the corner holding a guitar, not as the hired band, but just playing for a small group of friends. He wasn't loud or showy. There was a quiet confidence to him, an intense focus as his fingers moved over the strings. The music was soulful, complicated, and sad in a way that just felt honest. He looked up, and our eyes met for just a second. He gave a small, almost apologetic smile, like he'd been caught in a private moment. Later, my friend dragged me over to introduce us. His name was Jake. He was a musician. Up close, his charm wasn't a performance, it was more like a quiet hum. He had this way of listening, really listening, that made you feel like you were the only person in the room. He asked about me, not what I did, but what I was passionate about. When I slipped into my usual spiel about my business, he gently steered the conversation. "No, I can see you're successful," he said. "I want to know what makes you tick. What did you dream about when you were a kid?" No one had asked me that in years. Jake seemed to be on a completely different frequency. He talked about art, emotion, about capturing a feeling in a melody. He was charming, of course, but more than that, he was a relief. He was a breath of fresh air in the smog of my ambition-driven life. He didn't seem to care about the CEO of a growing company. He just saw Harper, the woman who used to dream of other things. That night, for the first time in a long, long time, I didn't sneak home to my laptop. I stayed. I talked. I listened. I felt a forgotten part of myself stir back to life. I thought, this is different. Do you enjoy family drama? Like, subscribe. What happened next wasn't so much a courtship as it was a beautiful, all-consuming storm. Looking back, I can see it for what it was, love bombing. A classic tactic manipulators use to gain control with overwhelming floods of affection. But at the time, it felt like I'd finally found my soulmate. Jake's pursuit was relentless and intoxicating. My phone would buzz with poetic, rambling texts in the middle of the day. He'd leave voicemails of a new melody he was working on, telling me I was his muse. He'd show up at my office with my favorite coffee, not just once, but all the time. My employees all knew him. He was Harper's musician boyfriend, the romantic, free-spirited artist. He'd wait for me to finish work, no matter how late, sitting in the lobby just strumming his guitar. It felt so incredibly supportive. He showered me with attention and grand declarations of love that came shockingly early. Just weeks in, he was calling me the love of his life, his missing piece. He was building this intense emotional bond, and I was all too willing to help. His life story was a huge part of his charm. He was the classic struggling artist, a man of immense talent who was just waiting for his big break. He talked about his financial instability not as a flaw, but as a badge of honor, proof of his artistic integrity. He'd say things like, "I could write commercial jingles and make a fortune, but it would kill my soul." I really admired that. I, who had built a career on commercial appeal, was captivated by his purity. He was my opposite, and I thought that made us a perfect balance. He made a big show of being unimpressed by my success. He loved my passion, my drive, my mind. The money was just a side effect that he almost seemed to look down on. He would gently criticize my world, the corporate clients, the endless focus on growth. He'd mock my long hours, calling my work a kind of self-imposed prison. "Why don't you let me take care of you?" he'd say, a line that sounded like pure romance at the time. I now know it's a classic move to chip away at a woman's independence. He was slowly positioning himself as the rescuer, the one who could save me from my own ambition. I was so caught up in the romance, so flattered by the constant adoration, that I didn't see the trap he was laying. He wasn't just building a relationship, he was building a narrative. The topic of marriage came up naturally. 6 months into our whirlwind romance, it felt like the only logical next step. But as we started talking about a wedding, a quiet little voice in the back of my mind started speaking up. It was the voice of Harper, the CEO. That voice whispered one practical and deeply unromantic word: prenup. My business was my life's work. It was worth over $1 million and growing fast. And while I was head over heels in love, I knew that marriage was a financial partnership just as much as an emotional one. I knew its value would grow a lot during the marriage, and I wanted a clear line drawn around it. It wasn't about not trusting Jake, it was just responsible planning. I rehearsed the conversation, and one evening, I took a deep breath and brought it up. I explained it as a way to protect both of us, a formality my lawyer recommended. His reaction was immediate and absolutely devastating. The charming musician vanished. In his place was a man I'd never seen before. "A prenup," he said, his voice dripping with a deep, theatrical hurt. "You want me to sign a piece of paper that says you're already planning for us to fail?" He called it a cold, calculated insult. He told me it was a sign that I'd always value my company more than I valued him. He twisted my practicality into a deep emotional flaw, a betrayal of the pure love he claimed we had. He was using emotional blackmail to make me feel ashamed for even asking. My desire to be a responsible business owner was painted as a lack of faith in our love. Then, his voice cracking, he said, "My love for you is all I have, Harper. I'm not coming into this with stocks or $1 million company. I'm coming with my heart. And you're telling me that's not enough." The guilt was crushing. He had so skillfully built this image of himself as the poor but noble artist, and I, the wealthy businesswoman, was now playing the villain. He ended his performance with the perfect, heart-wrenching ultimatum: "Our love is the only contract we need. If you don't believe that, then maybe we shouldn't be getting married at all." With that threat hanging in the air, I broke. I caved. What was more important? A piece of paper, or the man I was convinced was my soulmate? I told him he was right. We did end up signing a prenup, but it was rushed, and I would later learn, full of loopholes. My heart wasn't in it. I pushed the signed papers and the ugly memory of that fight to the back of my mind. We got married 6 months later, and I had no idea I had just handed my future enemy the exact weapon he would one day use to try and destroy me. The first year of our marriage was, for the most part, happy. Jake was the doting husband, the supportive partner. I felt like I finally had it all, a thriving business and a loving husband. I was 32, and my life felt perfectly complete. The shift was subtle at first. It started with language. Little comments here and there. When a big check from a client came in, he'd say, "That's great. We should use our money to finally take that trip to Italy." My company's revenue was now being talked about like it was a joint checking account. Then came the resentment, disguised as concern. If I had to work late, the supportive partner was replaced by a sullen, passive-aggressive man. "Are you really working again?" he'd ask, his tone making it clear I was neglecting him. "That company is the other woman in our marriage, I swear." I started to feel guilty for my success. I found myself downplaying big wins, trying to shrink myself and my achievements to make him feel bigger. The dynamic was slowly, poisonously changing. He wasn't my cheerleader anymore, he was my critic. His music career was completely stagnant. He had meetings that never went anywhere and recording sessions that were always next month. The noble artist started to look a lot more like a guy who just lacked discipline. He became more critical of my friends and my family, anyone from my old life. It was a classic isolation tactic, meant to make me more dependent on him. The world he was building was shrinking, with him at the center. The financial pressure grew. He developed expensive tastes, for watches, cars, a lifestyle his music could never pay for. He resented the source of the money but felt completely entitled to its benefits. I was constantly walking on eggshells, trying to manage his fragile ego while also running a demanding business. I was so busy trying to hold it all together that I never stopped to ask myself, what was Jake actually contributing to this partnership? The fights about money became the soundtrack to our marriage. He'd grown accustomed to the lifestyle but grew to despise the work it took from me to maintain it. He wanted the fruits of my labor without having to see the labor itself. He felt entitled. That's the only word for it. He believed his presence in my life was such a major contribution that it warranted an equal share of the profits. His occasional unpaid work for my company became a big issue. In the narrative he was building, he was an unpaid consultant, a strategic advisor crucial to my success. It was delusional. The breaking point came on a Tuesday night. I had just closed the biggest deal in my company's history. I came home ecstatic, holding a bottle of champagne, ready to celebrate. I found him in the living room, surrounded by new, expensive-looking music equipment. "What's all this?" I asked, my smile faltering. "Decided to finally build out my home studio," he said, not even looking up. I looked at the boxes. I knew they cost tens of thousands of dollars. "Jake," I said, my voice tight, "we didn't talk about this." He finally turned to look at me, his eyes cold. "You just landed a huge deal, right? Don't tell me we can't afford it. Besides, this is an investment in my career. You invest in your company all the time. Why can't I invest in mine?" "Because you're using my company's money to do it." I finally snapped. "This isn't our money, Jake. It's the money I bleed for every single day while you're here buying toys." The dam broke. He shouted about how I held the money over his head, how I made him feel like a charity case. And then he said it. The line that changed everything. "You know, for a smart businesswoman, you're pretty stupid, Harper. You think this company is just yours? I've been here for 4 years. I've supported you. I've put my own career on hold to be your emotional support animal. I've earned my keep. Half of this is mine, and you know it." In that instant, the whole illusion just shattered. I looked at him, this angry, entitled man spitting poison at me, and I didn't recognize him at all. He didn't love me. He resented my success, and he believed he was owed a piece of it. I was silent. Finally, I looked at him and said, with a terrifying calmness, "I think I want a divorce." He just stared at me, his anger replaced by shock. But then, a strange, calculating look came over his face. It was the look of a man whose game was just called, and who was already planning his next move. Filing for divorce felt like a death, but also like finally being able to breathe. I was 34. I assumed we'd divide our personal stuff and go our separate ways. I was so naive. About 2 weeks after I filed, a thick envelope arrived from a law firm I didn't recognize. My hands were shaking as I opened it. It was a formal legal claim. Jake wasn't just agreeing to the divorce. He was making a claim against my company. He was demanding 50% of its total value. But it was the next part that made my world spin. The legal basis for his claim? He was using the prenup, the very document he had called an insult. His lawyers argued that while the prenup said the business was mine before the marriage, it was vague about the growth in value during the marriage. And they argued that this growth was a community asset. They claimed his contributions were instrumental to the company's success. They listed his occasional unpaid work and his consistent emotional support as foundational pillars that allowed me to thrive. They were turning love and partnership into a line item on a balance sheet. I felt sick. This wasn't a man lashing out in pain. This was a calculated, premeditated attack. The conversation about the prenup years ago flashed in my mind, his theatrical hurt, his manipulation. It was like reading the playbook of a con artist, unfolding in cold, hard legalese. I immediately called my lawyer, Sarah. I read the paragraphs to her over the phone, my voice shaking with rage and disbelief. Sarah was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Okay, Harper. This is a classic, dirty move. His lawyers are going to argue that his emotional support freed you up to focus on the business. They'll say his unpaid work, no matter how small, was a contribution. They're going to twist your entire marriage into a business partnership where he was the unpaid and now wronged partner." The betrayal was so profound it felt physical. The man I had shared a life with was systematically dismantling our history and reassembling it into a legal argument for why he was entitled to half of my soul's work. The nightmare was just beginning. The months that followed were a special kind of hell. The legal process is called discovery, and I quickly learned why. My lawyer, Sarah, explained that in a battle like this, everything was ammunition. My life, my work, my private conversations, all of it was about to be picked apart by strangers. Sarah laid out the legal landscape. "Here's the problem," she said. "The law presumes that if a business owned by one spouse grows in value during a marriage, that growth can be considered community property if the community, meaning the time, work, or support of either spouse, contributed to it. His lawyers are going to say your work during the marriage created all that new value. And since your time and effort during a marriage are considered a community asset, the value created by that effort is a community asset, too. That's the pot of gold thereafter." It was the most twisted logic I'd ever heard. I was being penalized for my own hard work. The depositions were the worst part. Listening to his testimony was surreal. They twisted our history until it was unrecognizable. A time I was sick with the flu and he brought me soup became providing critical care that allowed the CEO to recover and close a major deal. They talked about his occasional unpaid work with dead seriousness. His lawyer asked, "Mr. Phillips, can you describe the marketing campaign you helped develop?" Jake cleared his throat. "Yes." Harper was struggling with a tagline. I suggested something more authentic, more soulful. I believe my input was vital. I wanted to scream. He had mumbled, "That sounds lame," while watching TV. That was his vital input. But the most insulting part was how they framed his emotional support. His lawyer would ask, "Did you see it as your role to provide a stable home environment so your wife could focus on her demanding career?" "Absolutely," Jake said, with rehearsed sincerity. "I considered it my full-time job to support her genius." They were putting a price tag on the performance of his love. They were arguing that his very presence in my life was a professional service, and they were now submitting an invoice for millions of dollars. The legal battle dragged on, and the emotional toll was devastating. I lived in a constant state of anxiety. My breaking point came after a brutal day of depositions. Jake's lawyer insinuated that the stress of my job had made me an emotionally neglectful wife. I came home to the empty house and just broke. I sank to the floor and sobbed, for my marriage, for the betrayal, for the fear that he might actually win. Lying on the floor, I realized I couldn't do this alone. I found a therapist, who helped me separate the grief from the anger. The lawsuit, she told me, wasn't personal. That's a business transaction, she said. A hostile takeover attempt. You need to stop seeing him as your ex-husband and start seeing him as a competitor. This mental shift unlocked something in me. I went from victim to fighter. But the real breakthrough came from my lawyer, Sarah. She had a nagging feeling. This is too slick, she told me one day. The legal filings, the narrative. It's a perfect script. Almost like they've done this before. On a hunch, she started digging. Not into Jake, but into his lawyer, a woman named Catherine Albright. She ran deep background checks, searched legal databases from other states, and cross-referenced names and timelines. One night, my phone rang late. It was Sarah. Are you sitting down? She asked. Catherine Albright's maiden name isn't Albright. It's Phillips. Catherine Phillips. She's Jake's older sister. The line went silent as my mind reeled. Sarah continued, her voice tight with fury. And that's not all. I found 2 other cases, one in Arizona, one in Oregon. Different names, but the same MO. A charming, artistic man marries a successful female business owner. A few years later, a messy divorce. And in both cases, the wife settles for a fortune to avoid a career-destroying trial. In both cases, the opposing counsel was Catherine. It all clicked into place with horrifying clarity. The chance meeting at the party. The love bombing. The perfectly rehearsed fight about the prenup, designed to make me sign a flawed document. The slow, methodical isolation. The final, staged fight. It wasn't a marriage that had soured. It was a long con. And I was just the latest mark. After a year of legal warfare, the judge pushed for mediation. His team was confident. We were at a stalemate, with his outrageous demand on one side and my refusal to reward a thief on the other. I was ready to walk and go to trial. But Sarah had a different plan. Let's ask for one final meeting, she said, a sharp glint in her eye. Everyone in the same room. We sat at a long conference table. Jake, looking smug in his expensive suit. His lawyer, his sister Catherine, looking poised and ruthless. They thought we were there to surrender. The mediator began, but Sarah cut him off. Before we begin, she said, placing a folder on the table, I'd like to address opposing counsel directly. She looked right at Catherine. I have a few questions for you, Ms. Albright. Or should I say, Ms. Phillips? The color drained from Catherine's face. Jake froze, his smirk vanishing. Sarah continued, her voice like ice. We're very interested in your past work. For instance, the case of a tech founder in Arizona in 2017, and a restaurateur in Oregon in 2020. 2 women, both recently divorced, who paid out massive settlements to clients of yours who bear a striking resemblance to your brother. She slid photos and documents across the table. This isn't a divorce proceeding anymore, Sarah said calmly. This is conspiracy to commit fraud. And that carries consequences far beyond this room. Disbarment. Criminal charges. The air was sucked out of the room. Jake looked at his sister, his face a mask of pure panic. The predator was now the prey. All the rehearsed sincerity, the practiced charm, it all melted away. I saw him for what he was, a common thief in a nice suit, a puppet whose sister pulled the strings. He started to speak, to stammer something, but I held up my hand. For the first time, I spoke directly to him. You're done. The power in the room had shifted completely. We weren't negotiating. We were dictating terms. There was no compromise. He walked away with nothing. 0. The only thing he got was our agreement not to press criminal charges and report his sister to the Bar Association, on the condition that they both dissolve the case and disappear from my life forever. Writing a check for a settlement would have been painful. Watching them sign a document that confirmed they were getting absolutely none of my money was the most satisfying moment of my life. It wasn't a bruised victory, it was absolute. In the months that followed, there was a profound quiet. The roar of the battle was gone, and I had to learn how to live without a fight. I came out of that fire a different person. I was a survivor, but I was also wiser, harder, and infinitely more careful. I learned a lesson that goes beyond the collision of love and business. I learned that some people aren't just opportunistic, they are professional predators. Their deception is a craft they have honed. So what's the lesson here? Watch for the red flags, yes. The love bombing, the guilt trips about success, the entitlement to your money. But also, do your due diligence. In a world where you can find out almost anything about anyone, use that power. A partnership, personal or professional, is an investment. Vet your partners. And never, ever let someone shame you for protecting what you have built with your own 2 hands. A strong prenup isn't unromantic, it's a firewall. This was a professional, premeditated attack, and sharing the details isn't easy. But the shame and isolation these predators rely on is their greatest weapon. Taking that power back starts with telling our stories and exposing their methods. I'd love to hear from you in the comments. Have you ever encountered a situation that felt too slick, too scripted to be real? Sharing our experiences is how we arm each other with knowledge. If this story resonated with you, please give this video a like, and subscribe for more stories about overcoming life's biggest challenges. Your support helps create a community where these important conversations can happen, and it truly means the world. Thank you for listening.